The oldest records in Ravenford County, archived between yellowed pages and hardcover books, all begin the same way when referring to this case. There were no signs of a struggle. This phrase is repeated, dry, objective, and yet insufficient. In the fall of 1897, Ravenford was a small community, isolated among low hills, dirt roads and fields that seemed endless when viewed from above. The place lived off corn farming, cattle raising, and an almost unchanging routine, guided by sunrise and sunset. The nights were quiet, interrupted only by the wind blowing through wooden fences and the occasional creak of poorly fitted doors. It was there that Elias Crowell lived, a 39-year-old farmer, father of two, described in parish records as punctual, reserved, and overly careful with his habits. Elias was not known for adventures, nor for conflicts. He was, according to his neighbors, someone who followed predictable paths, and perhaps that is why his disappearance caused so much silent discomfort, rather than immediate panic. The Crowell home was just over a mile from the village center, near a secondary road rarely used after dusk. Built of light wood, with a front porch and a low barn in the back. It was considered modest but well maintained. His wife, Margaret Crowell, kept detailed household records, shopping lists, harvest schedules, bills paid by hand in firm handwriting. These notebooks, preserved for decades, would later be analyzed as key pieces of what we are now trying to reconstruct. That year, the weather had been unstable. Unseasonal rains, early cold nights, and irregular harvests created a diffuse feeling of unease among the residents. Nothing that turned into open conversation, just small comments exchanged at the end of Mass or at weekly meetings at the local market. Still, later reports indicate that Elias seemed more attentive than usual. He frequently watched the road, he double-checked locks, and, according to a statement taken years later, he used to write down times on loose pieces of paper, which he kept in his coat pocket. Official documents do not record any family conflicts. There is no mention of significant debts, known threats, or public disagreements. On the contrary, Elias was seen as someone trustworthy, occasionally chosen to help neighbors with repairs or transporting groceries. His name appears repeatedly in community records, always associated with the word present. On the morning of October 17, 1897, Elias left home before dawn, as he did almost every day. The plan, as reported by Margaret, was simple. Check a neighbor's barn about 2 miles away and return before noon. He took only his dark coat, his usual hat, and a small notebook folded in his inside pocket. No personal items were later reported missing. What is known for certain is that Elias never reached his destination. No neighbor saw him pass by. No sound was heard. No clear marks were found on the dirt road, even though the light rain the night before had left the ground conducive to tracking. For decades, the case was cited as just another rural disappearance, a man who simply did not return. However, while reviewing the local registry office's files, a researcher found something that had never been properly analyzed. A marginal note, written in lighter ink, added days after the official record. A short sentence, no signature, no explanation, and that was exactly when the silence began to seem less accidental. The days leading up to Elias Crowell's disappearance carried, at first glance, no obvious signs of disruption. Life in Ravenford followed its usual course, marked by rigid routines and an almost comforting predictability. Mornings began early, with the distant sound of tools, footsteps on damp earth, and steam rising from mouths on the first cold days of autumn. Elias was part of this rhythm with almost mechanical precision. According to statements taken years later, he always woke up before the light touched the horizon. He fed the animals, checked the fences, wrote down simple numbers in his notebook, quantities, schedules, small observations about the weather. These were not sentimental notes. They were functional, objective records, as if every detail needed to be kept under control so that the day would not deviate from the expected. Margaret described, in a report made to the local reverend months after the incident, that her husband seemed quieter during that period. Not absent, just restrained. He responded with short sentences, avoided long conversations, and on some nights he remained seated at the table even after the lamps were extinguished, staring at the front door as if waiting for something that never came. Still, she reported no arguments, no fear, just a change of pace that was difficult to name. The children, both too young to fully understand what was happening, remembered only small interruptions in their routine. Their father checking his watch more often than usual, his gaze lingering on the road when someone rode by on horseback. The gesture of closing the window even when the air was stifling. Details that, taken separately, meant nothing, but which years later came to be seen in a different light. In the village, the neighbors kept in frequent contact. There was a tacit trust between the families built on mutual need. In later statements, many said that Elias had vaguely mentioned errors in the records and times that didn't add up. When questioned, he would change the subject or downplay it, saying it was just the usual confusion during harvest time. None of these comments were considered relevant at the time. No one formally noted them down. One of the few documents preserved from that period is the local grocery store's ledger. It shows that Elias was there 2 days before he disappeared, buying items that were unusual for his routine: thin rope, an extra candle, and loose paper. The shopkeeper did not find this strange. In Ravenford, improvisation was part of survival. Still, the recorded time, shortly before closing, was out of character for Elias, who usually shopped in the morning. Another detail, equally ignored, appears in a secondary road maintenance report. A county-hired worker mentioned finding irregular marks on the road, as if something heavy had been dragged a short distance before disappearing onto solid ground. The report was filed away without further investigation. The marks were not associated with any damage or formal complaint. The night before the disappearance, a light rain fell over the region. Nothing that would prevent travel, but enough to alter sounds, smells, and the perception of the environment. Margaret noted in her household notebook that Elias returned later than usual, his coat damp and his boots dirty with dark mud, unlike the light-colored soil around the house. When questioned, he replied only that he had taken a different route. These records did not cause immediate alarm. The Ravenford community was accustomed to accepting minor inconsistencies as part of rural life. Routes changed, schedules got mixed up, people made mistakes. Only decades later, when gathering scattered testimonies, account books, and marginal notes, did it become evident that something was out of place, not abruptly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, as if Elias's disappearance had not begun on the day he vanished, but in the quiet days that no one thought important enough to observe closely. And it was precisely this accumulation of ignored details that would transform what seemed like a simple disappearance into something more disturbing than any immediate absence. Elias Crowell's disappearance was not recorded as a sudden event. It was built, minute by minute, from small confirmations that were never completed. The last known day begins in a mundane, almost indifferent way, like so many others described in the Ravenford archives. On the morning of October 17, 1897, the sky was low, covered with dense clouds that filtered the light and left the world in opaque tones. The air carried the smell of wet earth from the previous night's rain. Margaret woke up to the sound of Elias moving around the house, his footsteps restrained, careful not to wake the children. He got dressed without turning on the lamp, an unusual gesture, as if he already knew exactly where each object was. She heard him close the front door shortly before dawn. There was no prolonged farewell, no unusual words, just the dry sound of wood meeting the doorframe. According to the stated plan, Elias would take the back road to Jonah Miller's property, where he would help check a barn with structural problems. The route was familiar, used for years, and offered no obvious dangers. Even so, no resident confirmed seeing him that morning. No greetings, no waves. No silhouette outlined against the low fog. The first sign of his absence appeared before noon. Jonah Miller waited until the agreed time, then until early afternoon. Realizing that Elias would not arrive, he assumed it was a common delay. Only at dusk, when his return no longer made sense, did he decide to notify Margaret. She responded with restrained serenity, stating that her husband sometimes lingered when helping neighbors. Still, she left a lamp on the porch that night. The silence on the road continued. The next morning, Elias's hat was still not in its usual place. The notebook he usually carried was also not found at home. His extra boots remained under the bed. No essential items had been taken other than what he was wearing. Margaret wrote just one short sentence in her notebook. He didn't come back. The first searches were informal. Neighbors walked along nearby stretches of road, calling Elias's name at regular intervals. The sound of their voices quickly faded away among the hills. There was no answer. There was no significant echo, only the wind dragging dry leaves along the path. On the third day, local authorities were notified. A small group walked the expected route, observing the ground still marked by irregular traces of rain. Near a little used bend in the road, about 2 kilometers from the village, they found something that would be recorded in an almost bureaucratic manner. Confusing marks on the ground, partially erased, as if someone had stopped there for a few minutes. They were not clear footprints. They did not indicate running or fighting, just interruption. A fragment of damp, crumpled paper with no visible writing was also found there. The material was collected, dried, and filed away. No further analysis was done at the time. One detail, however, caught the attention of one of the men present: the absolute silence around them. No animals nearby, no sound of insects, even though the season still allowed it. The report is not in the official record, but it appears in an informal statement given years later, noted in the margin of a parish book. That night the search was interrupted. The absence of concrete signs led to the initial assumption that Elias might have strayed from the path, perhaps by choice. Still, no one could explain why someone so methodical would abandon his route without warning. Days passed. No body, no additional belongings, no direct witnesses. The notebook Elias carried was never found. It was only the following week that the last confirmed evidence emerged: a forgotten record in the control book of the neighboring region's railway depot. A name, a time, an incomplete signature smudged by haste or moisture. The time did not match the narrative accepted until then. This record indicated that Elias, or someone using his name, had been in a place where no one believed he could have arrived in that time frame. And from that point on, all previous certainties began to crumble in silence. The news that Elias Crowell's name had appeared outside the expected boundaries of Ravenford spread in a restrained, almost embarrassed manner. There were no public announcements or formal meetings. The information circulated by word of mouth, in low voices, as if repeating that detail aloud could make it more real or more disturbing. County authorities cautiously reviewed the railroad depot's records. The book indicated an entry made in the late afternoon of the day of the disappearance, at a station located more than 15 kilometers from Ravenford. The distance was not impossible, but it would require continuous travel, without detours, along little-used trails. The recorded time left too little margin for comfortable coincidences. The employee in charge of the depot, already elderly at the time of the review, said he did not remember the face of the man who had signed the book. He only said that he seemed tired, quiet, and did not ask any questions. At smaller stations, anonymity was common. People passed through. Names were written down, and life went on. This testimony, however, was never included in the final report. The incomplete signature, just EC, was considered insufficient as definitive proof. Still, for some later investigators, it would become the most uncomfortable point in all the documentation. Meanwhile, in Ravenford, Elias's absence began to alter collective behavior. Searches gradually decreased, replaced by routines of silent vigilance. Doors began to be locked earlier. Side trails were avoided at dusk. Elias's name was no longer mentioned frequently, not out of forgetfulness, but because of a tacit agreement that nothing new could be said. Margaret, for her part, maintained a stance that many described as too firm for someone in recent mourning. She continued to record expenses, take care of the house, and attend Mass. In her notebooks, however, different notes appeared: crossed-out schedules, repeated accounts, observations with no apparent context. On one page, written weeks after the disappearance, there is a single sentence: "They didn't check." It is not known what she was referring to. Some neighbors began to report small episodes that they had not previously considered relevant. A man who claimed to have seen Elias talking to someone unknown near the road days before his disappearance. A woman who remembered hearing footsteps around her house on that rainy morning, but did not open the door. None of these reports could be confirmed. None were formally recorded. Over time, the accepted version became simple. Elias had gotten lost, abandoned the route, or decided to leave for personal reasons. The explanation met the practical need to close the case. It required no further investigation. It created no prolonged discomfort. Decades later, while reviewing the preserved documents, a researcher noticed something that had escaped everyone involved. The time noted at the railroad depot coincided exactly with a gap in Ravenford's records. A gap of almost 2 hours during which no resident reported seeing Elias, neither before nor after. The evidence had always been there. The name, the time, the possible distance. But no one at the time compared the data carefully enough. And so the case was closed not for lack of clues, but for overconfidence in the initial conclusions. More than 40 years had passed since Elias Crowell's disappearance, when the last documents related to the case were finally gathered into a single file. The paper was already fragile. The ink faded. Many of the names mentioned no longer belonged to anyone alive. Still, the absence remained intact, like a blank space that time refused to fill. Ravenford had changed. The secondary road had been partially absorbed by new routes. The railroad depot had closed. The Crowell house had stood for decades before being dismantled piece by piece, without ceremony, like so many other buildings of the period. Nothing in the place indicated that there had once been a man whose absence shaped the silent behavior of an entire community. Margaret lived to an advanced age. She never remarried. She never left Ravenford. In her later years, according to medical records, she spoke little and avoided questions about the past. After her death, her notebooks were donated to the local parish, where they were stored without proper cataloguing for years. It was there that the researcher found her last note about Elias, written in irregular, almost shaky handwriting. If they had looked properly, it wouldn't have been like this. There were no direct accusations. There were no names. Just the realization that something had been lost, not through absolute mystery, but through human carelessness. The study of the records does not offer a definitive answer. It does not say where Elias went, nor why. What it reveals, with growing discomfort, is a sequence of small failures. Schedules not compared, reports ignored, signatures discarded, because they seemed too incomplete to matter. Each detail, taken alone, seemed insignificant. Together they formed a possible path, one that no one decided to follow. Today, the case of Elias Crowell is cited only in footnotes, when mentioned at all. Not as an unsolvable enigma, but as a silent example of how the truth can be present without being recognized. There were no cries, no pursuits, no dramatic late revelations. There was only a rush to conclude, and a comfort in accepting what seemed simplest. Perhaps Elias left Ravenford by choice. Perhaps he was prevented from returning. The documents do not say. They only show that there was a moment when the answer was within reach and went unnoticed. And when that happens, the disappearance no longer belongs to the man who vanished, but to those who were too close to look closely.